Alrighty, the next accessory I'm making for the router table is a featherboard, and seeing as I'm making one, I'll make two, as I'll be able to also use these on the table saw. The instructions ask for wood that is 7.5 inches long by 4 3/8 inches wide by half an inch thick. I've got some pallet wood pieces roughly that size, and after milling it down it should be what I require. I don't want to bore you with the milling process, so let's skip on to the next step. I square off the pieces with the miter sled and then mark the ends at a 30-degree angle. I decide to make each of these featherboards different lengths and mark them accordingly. Using the table saw miter gauge, I cut it at 30 degrees. It might look like I'm off my cut line, but my sliding bevel wasn't exactly 30 degrees when I was marking it, so not to worry there. Now it's time to cut the feathers into the boards, and I need to set the blade to 30 degrees. So I use the offcut piece to make sure it's the same as my cut bevel. I need to add a longer fence to the miter gauge for the next steps, so I use an offcut from the tabletop and screw it to the gauge. This will work nicely. I'm going to cut the feathers on both boards at the same time, so I'm going to tape them together to stop them from moving. With the boards clamped to the fence, it's time to make the cuts. The first cut takes a little longer, as this one needs to also cut through the fence. Now it's a simple matter of releasing the clamp, sliding the board across, clamping in place, making the cut, and then repeating. This takes a little bit of time, but before long it's all done. I also need to cut the slots for the threaded knobs to pass through to the miter track. So I mark out where I need to make these cuts, and then adjust the height of the blade to its maximum. I then line up the blade to the existing cuts and proceed to extend the cuts, and then also cut out the waste in the middle. Now I can drill the hole at each end of these slots to round them off, which doesn't take long to do at all. After that, a little bit of chiseling and filing is required to finish them off. There's a few fibres left in between each of the feathers, so I use my ruler wrapped with sandpaper to clean them up, and once this is done, I no longer need them taped together. Once I've taken them apart, they look pretty fancy. With them now separated, it's time to give them a good sanding, using 180 and 240 grit papers here. However, on reflection, I forgot that the longer piece needs longer slots, so I used a shorter piece to mark those out, and then back to the drill press to make those holes. Then onto the table saw to extend the cuts on the slots. This worked well, however, due to the radius of the saw blade, I need to do a bit of filing to finish off the ends of the slots, which doesn't take too long. After all of that, I'm doing one last sanding on this piece, and then a quick cleanup using the air compressor before moving on to some finishing. I'm going to use the hard wax on these pieces. It's pretty straightforward, however getting in between each of the fingers took some working out. I found that the best method was to put wax at the end of each finger and then use a ruler with a cloth to push it down to the end. I left these to absorb the wax before giving them a quick wipe down to remove any excess. Well, that's all there is to it. The hard work is done. These will mount into the miter track using these track nuts, and I'll screw the threaded knobs into them. Once they're in the track, I can slide the threaded rods into the slots on the featherboard, and then once it's in position, tighten the knobs, and hey presto, it's just like I bought one. But the proof is in the pudding. Are these going to actually be useful, or are they just another gimmick that I don't need? Well, let's do a route on the router table and find out. I've got a router bit positioned to cut a rabbet. I slide my material in between the fence and the featherboard, and then tighten the featherboard up once it's pressed against the material. And I've also got the vacuum connected to the rear attachment, so let's turn the vacuum on. Finally, we'll reach under the table and power on the router, and we should be right as rain. So I start off pushing it through, and it's feeling good. One thing I'm noticing when looking back at the footage is how well the vacuum attachment is working. I'm not seeing any dust flying around. At this point, I realise I should be using my push stick, so I grab it and keep going with the route, and I'm extremely happy about how stable and safe this feels. So the featherboard really does make a significant difference to how easy and safe it is to use the router table. I'm very glad I decided to make this accessory. Inspecting the rabbit once the router has been turned off and it looks perfect. No complaints here. While I wrap up this episode, I'll leave you with some footage using the featherboard on my table saw. The only remaining thing on this build is the safety power switch. It will make turning the vacuum and the router on and off much quicker and safer. So stay tuned to the next episode for that. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye!